give you an update on the 5 o'clock time period here on FSU Weather. As of course, we're tracking Hurricane Idalia approaching the Florida Big Bend here. And again, we want to stress how important this and how historical this is actually going to be here across much of the area, as we've never seen a major hurricane make landfall here across Appalachia Bay. So again, we want to stress how important this actually is and how catastrophic it might be. So here's a live view at Doak. I'll actually step off camera here to kind of show you the whole scope here. We have those clouds starting to move in from the Gulf right now. That's some of those upper level clouds moving through, some mid-level clouds as well, as we did have a few showers come through as well. Currently not looking great. Here's another look. I believe, actually, I'm not sure where this is at. This is somewhere here in Florida where the raindrops perhaps on the lens there. So perhaps southwest Florida or downtown Tampa, I might say. I was just corrected. Thank you, Ryan. Here on the lens. So again, those showers are beginning to move their way into the Tampa Bay region, as we've been showing out throughout the entire show so far. And here, this is clear water, as again in the Tampa Bay area where we have those showers moving through. The raindrop there on the lens indicating that it is beginning to rain there, and it will likely continue to do so as we continue on throughout here. You mind giving me a? This is Cedar Key here, where we have those clouds also beginning to move in. The rain isn't quite here yet. It'll likely move in here probably as we get towards the sunset hours here. So probably in a few hours. As that whole rain shield continues moving up the coast, west coast of Florida. So here is the Atlantic wide view showing what's going on as we have an active pattern right now across the Atlantic Ocean here. I'm just stepping off screen just here for a moment. We have now newly designated Tropical Depression 11 here in the far near Africa there. We also have I should add it towards the Central Atlantic. We also have Franklin, which is still a pretty significant Category 3 hurricane over near Bermuda there, moving off to the northeast at 12 miles an hour. And this is actually fresh, hot off the press here from the National Hurricane Center here at the latest 5 o'clock advisory. Winds up to 100 miles an hour. If you remember, just 3 hours ago, we were actually at 90 miles an hour. So this storm is definitely on its way to strengthen to a really powerful hurricane as it does near the Florida coast here. So again, if you're plotting this on the map, we're 26.1 north, 84.8 west, moving to the north at 16 miles an hour. So here are some of the spaghetti model plots here, kind of showing where a lot of the models are kind of thinking the storm is actually going to end up, and it's been kind of the same over the past day or so, with it kind of trending yesterday back towards the Big Bend a bit, and that's not good news for us, of course, as that brings that likely for that core to be closer to our area, towards Tallahassee, and of course we don't want that here, as we've seen the potential for catastrophic damage could occur over the next 24 hours or so. But zooming in a little bit closer here, we do have a pretty tight, relatively tight cluster just off towards the east of Tallahassee. But really, it's not, at this point, it's not really going to matter much if we're taking, say, this line here, or if we're down over towards the east here. Or towards the west, I might add. We're going to see pretty much the same impacts. We might be expecting a major hurricane making landfall somewhere in the Big Bend, and unfortunately, it's on our area. And this essentially could be a life-changing event for many across the region. So here's the latest hurricane track here from the National Hurricane Center. Again, wind at about 100 miles an hour, moving north at 16 miles per hour. Pressure down to 972 millibars, and this will continue to fall as it strengthens over the next several hours or so. Cone doesn't look like it moved very much. Again, showing the detail of where we expect the landfall to be at, pretty much in the upper Appalachia Bay. They're really dangerously close to where we're at here in Tallahassee. And again, we probably won't know the exact landfall until it actually happens, because a lot of times when you have strengthening hurricane systems, we tend to have a lot of convection wrapping around the center of the circulation. What it could do, it actually could tug or wobble, so to speak, the eye in either direction as convection kind of spins up here around the eye. And that's why it may not be exactly at one location at this point, but we kind of have an idea it's going to be somewhere in this Big Bend region here, closer to our area. So here's more closer look at the cone here. I would say maybe it did move a tad back to the west, but still, I mean, not by very much. We kind of are still expecting the same impacts here across the Big Bend. A major hurricane making landfall sometime tomorrow morning here along the East Coast, around perhaps the mid-morning hours. That might be tweaked slightly as we get kind of closer to that point, but for the most part, at least the next plot shows Wednesday at 2 a.m. just off the Big Bend coast here, 115-mile-an-hour Category 3 hurricane in store here. So again, we want to stress how important, how life-threatening this potentially could be as it approaches landfall over towards the Big Bend here. So here's a visible satellite showing that actual overall, what we can kind of see from the naked eye if you were up there with the satellite here. And it shows clearly defining that circulation around those feeder bands kind of coming around, pivoting around, especially around the eastern side of the storm. And actually, over the past few frames, we might be actually starting to make out potentially where an eye could be forming right here as we get to the very last part. And you can see kind of this ruggedness look to the eye, and that indicates we have a lot of hot towers or a lot of these thunderstorms pumping up from near the eye. And what that indicates is that this storm is definitely intensifying, and we can prove that, of course, as we've seen the winds come up and the pressure go lower. So that is not a good sign here as we continue on throughout the rest of tonight and into early tomorrow morning, where we expect a landfall here on the Big Bend as a major hurricane. So this is not a good situation for many across the area. And we want to keep stressing that as we continue to monitor this system. So aircraft reconnaissance flights, we've been seeing them go in throughout the past 48 hours or so into the storm, showing, of course, and giving us more valuable data to which we can actually kind of ingest in the models, and then which they can kind of give us a better idea, a more accurate idea of what may happen. And at least the models have been showing over the past 24 hours or so more of a westerly trend back from where, say, a landfall near Cedar Key here, more of a landfall near St. Mark's. And that, again, that puts us closer to the potential landfall site where the eye will move on shore. And unfortunately, again, depending on exactly how it sets up at that time, that could put us not in a good position here in town, especially with the fact that we have a lot of trees in this area in the Big Bend. If we go through the eye wall, then that could knock down a lot of those trees there, and that's not what we want, because that can damage property, unfortunately. So we do have quite a bit of convection already going on here with these feeder bands coming in from the Gulf, and so this will continue on throughout the whole night. So you also want to make sure you're staying weather aware. Even though you may not be where the potential landfall site might be, you may potentially have a spin-up tornado or two coming near your direction, and that's something you definitely do not want to lay out and just, of course, just have there. You want to make sure you have those. You want to make sure you have do not disturb off, because again, if the National Weather Service in your local area issues a tornado warning, you want to make sure you're up for that and can stay up to date and figure out what's going on. So right now, it looks like we have a few severe thunderstorm warnings near Miami, also near Orlando, just south there in Osceola County, as well into the Space Coast there near Melbourne, where, again, these storms could potentially rotate a little bit and drop down a quick spin-up tornado or two. That's kind of the problem we have, at least with the northeastern sections of quadrants of the center of circulation of a landfalling tropical system, is you tend to have more wind shear, as we have at the surface a southerly flow, but then aloft you might have more of the westerly flow, at least in the northern hemisphere, in the northeastern sections of that storm, of that eye, and you can potentially get these little rotations embedded within these squalls. So even if it's not the embedded tornadoes, it could still be pretty terrible to be outside. We could have these tropical downpours dropping a lot of rain on particularly one area, and of course that can lead to potential of some flooding, flash flooding to be exact. And we expect that. And of course that would be worst case scenario, especially if you're along the west coast of Florida here, because along with the storm surge that will impact all these shorelines right here. If you kind of see my finger here, from about Naples all the way up, kind of snaking up the coastline towards Tampa, and then upwards more than that, is where we expect some pretty heavy storm possibility here as it makes landfall. And couple that with some of these torrential downpours, especially if we get what's called training, which means that we get the same storm kind of going over and over the same spot over and over again, we could potentially lead to a lot of rainfall accumulation. So that's why we want to be very close. We want to make sure you stay very alert and very weather aware tonight, even if you're in Fort Myers, Naples, or even inland areas in the central Florida peninsula, because we could still see some pretty catastrophic damage with some of these potential tornadoes that could form, even though the eye might be well, or like almost 100 miles offshore. Again, with that storm surge risk, with that tornado risk, again, you want to make sure you're really staying on your A game tonight, as we're going to see continuation of all this throughout the next several hours up until the morning hours tomorrow, where we expect a landfall from Hurricane Idalia in the middle morning hours here across the Big Bend. So again, we want to stress that over here in FSU Weather, to make sure you stay tuned with us, to make sure that you stay at least on tune here for up to date of what may occur over the next several hours here across much of the area. So again, social media, we'll be live here on YouTube most of the night here, so make sure you stay on track for all that. But we're going to send things off with more of an update from social media and such with Robert at the wall.
So right now, here is the National Weather Service Tallahassee Twitter, which is one of the best resources for weather updates in the Tallahassee area. And we're going to go through some of the most recent warnings and watches that were issued. We have a special weather statement right now, and this is for Steinhatchee. This is valid until 4:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, so this one's actually expired. But we do have several thunderstorms off the coast of the Appalachee Bay area that are still in that region, and that's an area that we're expecting to see a lot of weather for over the next few, I would say at least 12 to 24 hours as this storm continues its way into the region. So we're going to go back to the National Hurricane Center, and we're going to look at their cone right now and just sort of show you with the most recent update what this cone looks like and what you can expect to see as this storm continues moving forward. So right now, here it is at 5 p.m. on Tuesday. This area right in here, this sort of yellowish area, that is the extent of the tropical storm force winds as it moves its way off towards the north and east. So right here, this is the point of the storm, and you can see a little bit of maroon in there where they have that hurricane force winds. That's the area you really need to be concerned about. Where you have this red, this is the hurricane warning, and these blues are tropical storm warnings, and we actually do have a hurricane watch in effect for the Georgia and part of the South Carolina coast up there. So as this storm moves off towards the north and east, it's going to continue to intensify. The NHC forecast has it getting up to 115 miles per hour right before landfall, making landfall in the Appalachee Bay as a major hurricane. So it will be at least Category 3 strength, be pushing a lot of storm surge and wind up into this area, which will become very dangerous for those of you on the coast. So if you're anywhere on the Appalachee Bay, your Apalachicola, St. George's Island, St. Mark's, anywhere in there off towards Steinhatchee, down towards Cross City and Cedar Key, you need to be getting away from the coast as soon as possible. We're already seeing some of those tides coming through, presenting dangerous conditions for those in the area. So it's extremely essential that you get as far away from the coast as possible, because that is where that storm surge will be the worst. But we are seeing some potential for inland impacts as well. You can see the storm, it's moving off towards the north and east. It's going pretty far inland. It's still a hurricane, even in Georgia as a hurricane. So it's going to bring a chance for very strong winds, possibly down trees, maybe even causing discrete power outages in many areas, maybe even widespread power outages in the northern Florida area. So that's really the state of play right now. Current sustained wind is 100 miles per hour, so that is a Category 2 hurricane. It has now been upgraded to a Category 2, and we expect it to be upgraded to a Category 3 before it gets there. But let's not discount, I know we talk a lot about the storm surge, we talk a lot about the wind, but let's not discount the flooding potential. And I'm not talking coastal flooding, we're talking about inland flooding. So Tallahassee is under a moderate risk of inland flooding. We have up to 40% chance for inland flooding in Tallahassee, all the way up into Augusta and Wilmington. So creeks, streams, rivers in these areas will have a chance to overflow very quickly with the amount of rain they're getting. In some places up to maybe even 6-8 inches in a very short amount of time, and that will be enough to cause flash flooding potential. So even if you're not on the coast, don't think you're out of the chance for flooding. Those inland, even in parts like Georgia and South Carolina, can still see that chance for flooding even despite being hundreds of miles from the coast. So that's something to keep in mind. We do have a chance for day 1 and day 2 seeing that greatest flash flood risk over the next 3 days. And this is our day 2 outlook. This will be right when we have that storm at its worst over the Tallahassee and Augusta areas. But I did talk about storm surge. It's good to revisit that and just sort of emphasize how strong the storm surge can be. This purple area is up to 10 to 15 feet. Just to emphasize, imagine a person who is 5 foot tall. You need to stack 3 of them on top of each other to get 15 feet of storm surge, and that's coming into places that are at sea level. So possibly up to the 2nd story of some homes, above cars. So this is dangerous, dangerous surge. And this part of Florida is very marshy, particularly up into here, a little bit east of Tallahassee, into parts like Perry and Steinhatchee, very marshy. So it's very easy for some of that water to make its way through into that area. Parts of the Osceola River down to Yankeetown, the Ochlockany River still seeing about 7 to 11 feet. So even though it's not 10 to 15, that's still a lot of storm surge. So we have active storm surge warnings out for much of the Appalachee Bay. Let's not forget the rest of Florida. Tampa Bay still seeing up to 4 to 7 feet. That's going to be enough to cause significant concerns for the Tampa Bay area, even though you aren't seeing a direct impact from this storm. Charlotte Harbor 2 to 4, you still want to make sure you're not being out, you're not a marine, or you're not going out in the Charlotte Harbor as the storm makes its way through. And as another thing I want to emphasize, as the storm moves off towards the east, towards North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, maybe you can see 2 to 4 feet of surge between the St. Mary's River and South Carolina. So that's quite a lot of surge there. Important to remember that the impacts are not just around the landfall site, but it is perfectly valid to focus on the landfall site with this storm because this is an area that has not seen a storm this strong in quite a while. In fact, has not seen a storm this strong in this area since the 1950s and in this area since the 1800s. So that is something to keep in mind, that this area is really not, even though we saw Michael back in 2018, really not a good comparison because the strongest effects of Michael were not really seen in that area. I talked about rainfall. We'll look at our rainfall potential from the Weather Prediction Center, seeing up to maybe even 6 inches localized more in the area right around the landfall site. Here's where we're expecting that landfall right around Tallahassee. Could see more than 6 inches localized in some of these sites, all the way up to Augusta, seeing up to 6 inches as well, and Hatteras, 6 inches. So you can see this corridor of heavy rain followed with a storm, a very, very severe impact from the storm for sure. So as this storm continues making its way north, let's look at these wind speed probabilities. So for tropical storm force, we have a 90% chance of seeing tropical storm force winds in much of this area east of Tallahassee and northwest of Orlando and west of Jacksonville. This area around the Big Bend has a over 90% chance, and even in the city of Tallahassee has about an 80% chance of seeing tropical storm force winds, and this chance will only increase as the storm gets closer. I expect maybe more of these areas that are in your yellows here will turn purple just because the uncertainty of the track will continue to decrease as we get closer to it. But let's also look at the hurricane force because we are under a hurricane warning here in Tallahassee. Hurricane warning is going all the way east to parts like Gainesville and the I-75 corridor. Now these probabilities do look lower, but it's just because we are still about 12 to 24 hours out in some locations from seeing hurricane force wind gusts. So I wouldn't be surprised to see these probabilities go way up over the next 6 hours as this storm moves closer. And we do see almost a 50 to 60% chance of seeing hurricane force wind gusts along this area, right just around Perry, where we're expecting that landfall site to be a lot of model consensus with that storm around there. So that's our wind gusts there. We've gone through the peak surge as well. I just want to one more time go over the cone with you, just to really show you what we're expecting to happen with the storm. And the important part with this cone is it's not showing the size of the storm. This area around here is going to be showing the track of the center of the storm. And even inside this cone is only showing it about 2/3 of the time on average, particularly out towards the far 5-day period. So around here where you're seeing this white area, don't expect that just because you're in Gainesville or you're in Tallahassee, you're just outside of the cone, you won't be seeing anything. In fact, based on recent model runs, Tallahassee could be seeing quite severe conditions because it could but just barely graze part of the eye wall in here. And that would be consistent with this cone. It shows maybe taking the left edge of this cone, the western edge of this cone, and we taking very strong conditions with this area around Tallahassee. So again, we do have this cone here has the M right here shows a chance for a major hurricane. So it's going to intensify up to a category 3, 115 miles per hour. Possibly continue intensifying all the way up until it hits the coast, and then weaken a little bit to a hurricane in Georgia, tropical storm in South Carolina, and then come all the way eastern, possibly even over to Bermuda. So very, very long track of the storm, and it's moving at around right now 16 miles per hour, so it's gotten a little faster, but it's still going to be not quick moving. It's not going to be getting out of here in an hour. We could see conditions deteriorate in Tallahassee as early as 2 a.m. tonight, maybe even midnight, and could continue not being favorable until maybe even the late afternoon tomorrow. So again, this is our overview of the storm. We're now going to send things to the wall with Ryan and talk a little bit more about the storm conditions here that we have with Idalia.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see what conditions we have because we have a Category now 2 hurricane making its way closer and closer to us here in the Panhandle and the Big Bend. So let's kind of just start over. Let's take a look outside. The sun is out. We've got a nice kind of afternoon to finish up getting set up, finish up getting all our documents in waterproof containers, get our last minute needs, our water, all that stuff that we need because, again, sun is out. We've got kind of a few more hours before we start to really feel the effects of Hurricane Idalia. So we've got a couple of systems to keep an eye on. We've got this system that's coming off the coast of Africa, 20 to 50% chance of formation in the next week or so. We've got Tropical Depression 11. We've also got recently downgraded Hurricane Franklin, which is now a Category 3, was earlier Category 4. And then I think all of our attention recently, and deservedly so, has been on Hurricane Idalia, now a Category 2 hurricane with winds of 100 miles per hour as of the most recent update at 5 o'clock. And its pressure is now at 972 millibars, so as pressure goes down, the wind speeds and the intensity are going to go up. And again, like Robert mentioned, let's not kind of pay attention as much to the cone. Let's pay attention to the fact that it could go on the west side of this cone, it could go on the east side of this cone, and depending on where it goes, it's going to change its impacts for us here in Tallahassee and in the Big Bend and Panhandle region. So by about 2 a.m. tonight, it will be a Category 3 hurricane with 115 mile per hour winds. And as we get into the early morning hours tomorrow, that is when we're going to start to see conditions rapidly deteriorate, as it's expected to be a Category 3 hurricane making landfall here in the Big Bend and Panhandle region of Tallahassee, of Florida. And now I'm going to pass off to Aaron for a look at how storms form and how to be safe during these storms.
That's right. So we'll kind of take a more of a closer look at that here. But first off, we'll show you some cameras here across Florida here. So we're going to see this is Cedar Key here. So we have those cloudier conditions here over the Gulf. Eventually, this will turn darker, rainier, wetter, I might add, as those bands begin to move in towards the Big Bend of Florida. Right now, those bands are situated over the Tampa Bay region right now, and those will eventually pivot in that direction over along the west coast of Florida. So here's a visible satellite of Idalia here. So we have, right now, in other words, this is what you can see from space if you were up there on the satellite. So clearly you can clearly see a defined circulation around the center of low pressure there. And you can actually make out in the last few frames, potentially an eye might be forming. And not a lot to mention too, you see this little roughness effect here just around the eye. That kind of shows as a blur or a flip of convection coming up here around the center of Idalia, which will indicate a strengthening storm, which is not what you want to see this close to land and where it's going to land here. So again, very powerful storm coming up here. And we want to make sure that we are staying on alert here. So here's our live radar showing much in the way of those squalls coming in from about Miami all the way through Central Florida, so through Lake Okeechobee. Into Tampa right now is where we have that first squall. We'll have another squall coming in right behind it, and from Monroe County through Fort Myers, and another one back along the shore. And this will continue on throughout the night, just one squall after another squall making its way onto the coast of Florida here. So Key West, even though they're pretty displaced from the center, look, where my finger's at, that's where Key West is at. The center is right here. We see this little circulation effect right there on radar. It's pretty far away, but you're still seeing some of these squalls coming in from the south there. That's how broad and far-reaching these storms can be here. So again, we want to emphasize that you don't have to be just in the center there. You can see a lot in the way of activity outside of that. So spaghetti models here we have, again, they're very tightly clustered around the Big Bend area, which is not what you want to see this close to landfall, as we could expect the potential for a landfall around the Tallahassee area, which is not good news for us. Now, there is a tiny bit of a spread, but it doesn't matter at this point because, you know, if it makes landfall here versus, let's say, just off to our west here, for this model wants to show, then it would basically be the same impacts. We would have hurricane force conditions are remaining increasingly likely now across the Big Bend area. We want to emphasize how strong this could be. So here are the GFS ensemble models. So this is each parameter that's tweaked up a little bit to kind of show an idea of where it could go, this in the GFS model here. And it shows, again, pretty tightly clustered around the Tallahassee area. Zooming in closer, again, showing that cluster, unfortunately, right on top of us, which is not what you want to see this close to a major hurricane landfall. Your ensembles do the same thing, too. Perhaps a tad to the east, but not by much. Not enough to let your guard down whatsoever. You want to make sure you're staying on alert. You want to make sure you stay tuned to FSU Weather, also your local National Weather Service, emergency management for more information about what you may do in terms of evacuation orders or prep, other things like that. So here's the cone showing the upper level water vapor of Idalia. Again, you see those purples indicate those high cloud tops, those cold temperatures indicating a lot of robust activity near the center of circulation there, as it tracks off to the north and eventually the northeast. And it was supposed to be forecast to become at least a Category 3 by the time it makes landfall across the Big Bend. And why is that? That's because at least part of the reason why is because we have those ample warm temperatures out in the Gulf of Mexico. It makes them pretty deep too. So even if this storm were to, what we call upwell or bring some of that ocean content from the bottom up towards the surface, it's still not enough to really do much in terms of weakening anything. These are very deep waters, especially as you go further towards the west here, off the Florida shelf. That's one ingredient why we're seeing this rapid intensification occur with Idalia, and why we're seeing it potentially become a major hurricane as it makes landfall. And it's close to that, as again, we're at 100 miles an hour now as of the 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time advisory. This is 2 a.m., where it could be 115 miles an hour, where we could potentially see, again, even more strengthening up right now. But again, we'll have to watch as we continue on throughout the next several hours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sharon. And you mentioned and showed the Cedar Key camera. I just want to add on to that. Cedar Key is under a mandatory evacuation, and 98% of its residents have evacuated so far. And if you're that 2% of residents thinking, oh, I can wait it out, it'll be fine, I want you to evacuate. I'm going to show you a couple examples of what can happen. So we've got Category 1 hurricane, well, now it's a Category 2, but earlier was a Category 1 Hurricane Idalia with 74 to 95 mile per hour winds. Now Idalia, Category 2 hurricane, and I just want to show you what the damage can be here. We've got, if you're on the coast, we've got good storm surge coming in, some 100 mile per hour winds that can easily knock down power lines as we move towards Category 3, which it's expected to be as Idalia makes landfall. Look at just this 3D model of how hard the waves are coming in, the power lines snapped, major damage to your home. So if you think, if you're in Cedar Key or if you're under a mandatory evacuation and you're thinking of waiting this out, let's go ahead and take the advice of local officials and let's make those evacuations. And then if Idalia does further strengthen, which is not expected, but Category 4, 131 to 155 mile per hour winds, and then with the catastrophic Category 5, we've got 155 mile per hour winds. We've got houses submerged in water. So we really need to keep an eye on that. Storm surge wise, let's kind of think we're adding ocean surge and we're also adding wind, and we've got full moon, which is just adding to the tidal effect that Tampa Bay and coastal regions within this could be seeing lots of water enter both the Bay Area and the Atlantic, or the Gulf of Mexico rather, and as the storm surge starts to come on shore, it could add up to 12 feet of water as we go through the next couple hours. So let's walk through. We've got the last few hours of getting ready for Idalia before it makes landfall in the overnight hours tonight. Let's kind of walk through. We've got a few hours to prepare. Let's just keep an eye on what the NHC has to say. We'll keep providing you updates here on FSU Weather as well. If you're told to leave, please leave, because your local emergency managers, your local police departments, they know your area. They know if you're flood prone, if you're in a bad spot with wind, lots of trees might be around, power issues. I'd much rather see you leave than try to ride it out, because oftentimes they're not able to come rescue you in the event that you need it. And also keep those phones charged, get all your important documents together, and get pet supplies, get food supplies, anything you need. If you're waiting to board up, now is the time to finish up boarding up. And then as we enter the overnight hours tonight, that's when Idalia is going to start making landfall. But really going to want to pay attention for emergency alerts. If you have an app, also have another way to get some sort of warnings, whether it be a weather radio, maybe a backup app. Make sure Do Not Disturb is left off tonight as we go into the overnight hours. Find yourself a secure building. Get to the lowest floor you can. If you do end up in a spot with flooding, just try to stay inside and get away from the water as much as possible. And then the post-storm advice is, once we get to this time tomorrow, Idalia will start to push its way out of here. And we'll want to pay attention to what our local officials are saying. Definitely avoid down power lines. And if you do have phone battery left, save that battery for important emergencies. And if you need to document some damages to submit to your insurance company, do that at that time as well. But Aaron, we're still tracking Idalia. It's still going to make landfall here in the Panhandle or Big Bend region. What's the latest you're seeing?
That's right. And actually, one thing I do want to add real quick to the during the storm impacts is if you are in the unfortunate event of being in the eye wall there, you want to treat it as like a tornado warning. You want to go to the interior shelter because winds can be that high. But kind of back towards the current watches and warnings here across the area. There's a lot of red, which is not what you want to see here across the area, where we have hurricane warnings in that brighter pinkish kind of red. From about Naples, Collier County, all the way to the north there. Well, I should say actually Sarasota County to the north, we have that hurricane warning in effect, and that goes all the way till about the Forgotten Coast there, and then goes actually starting inching into Georgia too, kind of implying that once this goes, it's going to book it to the northeast, but more on that later. But for right now, we also have tropical storm warnings in effect for coastal, just offshore of the Emerald Coast there in the Panhandle, where off Panama City, Sudan. Again, even though you might say, I want to go for a boat ride tomorrow, and you're in Panama City or Destin, you don't want to do that because, again, we have the tropical storm conditions where the winds might be a bit stronger there over the Gulf of Mexico there. But even towards the central Florida peninsula there, we could see those tropical storm force conditions extending all the way as far south there as northern portions of the Miami metro area, and that's something we want to look out for as we've been seeing these squalls kind of coming in. So this is the GFS forecast wind speeds there. You can see that we're forecasting winds very high across much of the Big Bend there as it does eventually make its way into the area. And unfortunately, GFS has it going right over our area. So we replay that one more time. You can see that it's going right into Tallahassee. According to the GFS, that's one model here, one operational model. As it then goes off towards the northeast, we then eventually begin to clear out. This is the Euro model showing, again, pretty close to the GFS, maybe a tad bit off to the east, but once again, we're not going to see very much in the way of difference in terms of wind, according to these two models, at least according to these two model runs, I might add. So once after that, as we get into our Wednesday and Thursday, we should begin to clear right after all that disturbance moves away. So WPC flood potential, we do have a moderate risk of that potential today, more so tonight, along the coastal sections of the Big Bend. So St. George Island, Alligator Point, Ball Point, all seeing the potential for more flash flooding as we will begin to continue to see those rain bands coming in. And then also Tallahassee and then kind of arcing back towards along the Suncoast there towards Tampa, we also have the slight risk of some flash flooding. Tomorrow, according to that WPC, we're in the bullseye for the moderate risk, which is not something you want to see either, but I will say if you're in Gainesville or even Panama City or towards Destin, don't let your guard down as you could potentially still see some flash flooding over the next several hours after this as Idalia makes its way to the north. So GFS shows, unfortunately, the bullseye of where we see that strip of heaviest rainfall just over Tallahassee, basically, and that's not something, again, you want to see with the landfalling tropical system. That could indicate more flash floodings, more river flooding as well. And then Euro, very almost on track with having us right in the center of it. And this is something we haven't seen at all, since at least on record. So some active alerts. We do have that storm surge warning in effect for much of the Big Bend, the Nature Coast there, over towards the Forgotten Coast where we're at. Storm surge warnings in effect. And this goes from all the way through St. Mark's, Carabel, through Apalachicola is where we could expect some pretty good storm surge occurring, potentially almost upwards of near 15 feet of storm surge, which is not something, again, you want to see, especially where the eventual landfall of the storm goes, and then off towards just to the east of that is where we'll see the strongest of that. But make sure you stay tuned here on FSU Weather. We'll be back here